Joshua 22, beginning at verse 1. Then Joshua called the Reubenites and the Gadites and the half-tribe of Manasseh, and said unto them, Ye have kept all that Moses the servant of the Lord commanded you, and have obeyed my voice in all that I commanded you. You have not left your brethren these many days unto this day, but have kept the charge of the commandment of the Lord your God. And now the Lord your God hath given rest unto your brethren, as he promised them. Therefore now return ye, and get you to your tents, and unto the land of your possession, which Moses the servant of the Lord gave you on the other side of Jordan. But take diligent heed to do the commandment and the law, which Moses the servant of the Lord charged you, to love the Lord your God, and to walk in all of his ways, and to keep his commandments, and to cleave unto him, and to serve him with all of your heart and with all of your soul. So Joshua blessed them and sent them away, and they went unto their tents. Now to the one half-tribe of Manasseh, Moses had given possession in Bashan, but unto the other half thereof gave Joshua among the brethren on this side of Jordan westward. And when Joshua sent them away also unto their tents, then he blessed them. It seems like that there was a special blessing for this half-tribe. And he spake unto them, saying, Return with much riches unto your tents, and with much cattle, with silver, and with gold, and with brass, and with iron, with very much raiment. Divide the spoil of your enemies with your brethren. And the children of Reuben and the children of Gad and the half-tribe of Manasseh returned and departed from the children of Israel out of Shiloh, which is in the land of Canaan, to go unto the country of Gilead, to the land of their possession, whereof they were possessed, according to the word of the Lord by the hand of Moses. The closing verses of chapter 21, which we did not consider, we find there those verses attest to the fact that the Lord had made good on all of the promises that he had made to the children of Israel concerning their coming into this land, taking it, possessing it, and coming to rest here in the land of Canaan. And the Lord gave unto Israel all the land that he sware to give to their fathers. Verse 43 of chapter 21. They possessed it, and they dwelt in it. Verse 43 says, He gave them rest as he promised. Verse 44, in not one thing did he fail. In all the things that he promised, in not one thing did he fail. Joshua himself, as he gives them the final charges that he will give them as their captain before the Lord calls him home, he said, This day I'm going the way of all the earth. And you know in all your hearts and all of your souls that not one thing, not one good thing of all that the Lord hath promised has failed. All has come unto you, and not one thing has failed thereof. That'll be among the closing words of Joshua to the people. And here he says the same thing. It's recorded the same way. The Lord makes promise, and he keeps his promises. And though what they were to do in possessing this land looked like an impossible thing, and yet they believed God, and they came across that Jordan, and according to the instruction they were given by Joshua, coming from the Lord, they had been victorious. They had waged 2 major campaigns in which they had taken most of the land, and then the battles that they have fought to get each tribe into his own possession, into his own allotment, his own inheritance. There were still enemies to drive out, but they had depleted the enemies to the point that they now can have rest. and they can continue the work knowing that God will continue to be faithful and that they will possess their inheritance in full if they are faithful. But this is the way that chapter 21 concludes. He wraps it all up there. Everything, it's all done. He and Eleazar had granted the inheritances according to the lot, and all this is done. Even the Levites have their cities now and their suburbs. That's all settled. And then we read, then Joshua called the Reubenites and the Gadites and the half-tribe of Manasseh. And what we're reminded of here is that before the children of Israel ever set foot in the promised land, ever set foot in this land that God had promised to give them, God had sworn to give these 2.5 tribes, they had their portion, their possessions, 2 large territories on the other side of Jordan. There had been territories taken there that weren't in the plan as far as the children of Israel concerned. We know that nothing takes God by surprise, so that was in his plan. But we know that as they were preparing to come into the land, and they were taking their position, they needed to pass through the land of the Amorites and the Moabites. But they were forbidden to go through. These people did not allow them to go through. And that's how the children of Israel came about to possess these great, huge territories on the east side of Jordan. It was because, and unexpectedly actually to the children of Israel, these kings, Sihon and Og, refused to allow the children of Israel to go through their land. Listen as I read from Numbers chapter 21. Israel sent messengers unto Sihon, king of the Amorites, saying, let us pass through thy land. We will not turn into the fields or into the vineyards. We will not drink of the waters of the well, but we will go along by the king's highway until we be past thy borders. Sihon would not suffer Israel to pass through his border, but Sihon gathered all his people together and went out against Israel unto the wilderness, and he came to Jahaz and fought against Israel. And Israel smote him with the edge of the sword and possessed his land from Arnon to Jabbok, even unto the children of Ammon, for the border of the children of Ammon was strong. The Lord gave them that land. They weren't expecting to have it, but because Sihon would not let them go through, then they took his land. And this was, of course, the Lord that gave them this victory. Then we read a little later, thus Israel dwelt in the land of the Amorites, and they turned and went up by the way of Bashan, and Og, the king of Bashan, went out against them, he and all of his people, to battle at Edreel. And the Lord said to Moses, fear him not, for I have delivered him into thy hand, and all the people, and all his land, and thou shalt do to him as thou didst to Sihon king of the Amorites, which dwelled in Heshbon. So they smote him and his sons and all of his people until there was none left of them alive, and they possessed his land. So these two territories were taken because of the obstinance of these two kings. These are Lot's children. Why would they have expected to meet up with this type of refusal? They just wanted to pass through. They weren't going to take any of their produce. They weren't going to harm anything. They just wanted to pass through. And because Sihon and Og wouldn't let them go through, or refused to willingly let them go through, it cost them their land, cost them their lives, and God gave their territory to the children of Israel. You remember how that when the spies first went into the land, talked to Rahab, and then other times this would be mentioned, that those people in the land of Canaan, they knew what God had done to the kings of the Amorites and the Moabites. It was known, because for this people, Israel, to be able to take on these huge armies and come out victorious, but they knew, Rahab knew, that God had done that. That's the only way that could happen. God did it. So God gave his people this land. Now, as you know, Reuben and Gad and the half-tribe Manasseh, seeing these lands were rich and well-suited for cattle, and they were cattle people. The cattle may mean any type of livestock, sheep and goats and what have you. But they had livestock, and this land was perfect for them. It was a rich land, and they wanted that for their possession. And so they went and made request of Moses that these lands be given to them for their inheritance. In Numbers chapter 32, we have the record of this. We have how that they came to Moses in the first 5 verses of Numbers chapter 32. We see that they came to Moses with this request. Moses was not happy. And he said, you are going to discourage, you're going to dishearten the children of Israel. Don't you remember what the spies, the unfaithful spies, don't you know how they disheartened the people and the judgment that came? And now you're going to dishearten the people. There was only one way that Moses was going to allow this to happen. And that is if they went over into the land and fought with their brethren until all had their inheritance, and then they could return back to their inheritance. So we read here, and they came near unto him, that is to Moses, and said, we will build sheepfolds here for our cattle, and cities for our little ones. But we ourselves will go ready armed before the children of Israel until we have brought them unto their place, and our little ones shall dwell in the fenced cities because of the inhabitants of the land. And we will not return unto our houses until the children of Israel have inherited every man his inheritance. We will go fight, and we will not return to our families, our inheritance, until all are settled. Now we see in the chapter before, in the closing verses, all are settled. It's all done. And now, it was then that Joshua calls for the children of Reuben and Gad and the half-tribe of Manasseh. But now Moses agreed to this, but he also attached a great warning to it. Let me read that to you. Moses said, if you will go armed before the Lord to war, until he hath driven out the enemies from before him, and the land be subdued before the Lord, then afterward you shall return and be guiltless before the Lord and before Israel, and this land shall be your possession before the Lord. But if you will not do so, behold, you have sinned against the Lord, and be sure your sin will find you out. And that was the warning that he gave. And then they agreed to it. We're going to go fight. We will be there until the last dog's hung. We're going to be there until the last tribe gets his inheritance and settled and there's rest. And then we will return. So that all sounds good. They love this inheritance. They see these green pastures. They want this land, these rich cities. They want all of this. They want it really badly. And they want it bad enough that they'll agree to do this. Will they go through with it? Sometimes we want something so bad we'll sign our name to, I'll pay so many payments. Well, you can have this now and just make the first payment 1st of January. You don't have, and boy, we want it so bad. We'll sign some deal. But then when we have it, have buyer's remorse, and think, man, what have I gotten myself into? I got this thing now, and I got to pay for it. Well, they had made a deal. And actually, to be honest, they initiated it. They said, no, we're not going to discourage anyone. We will help them. We will go fight for them. And only then, after they have their possessions, will we come back to ours. And that is what Moses agreed to, and that's what they agreed to. And now we find that they have fulfilled all of their obligations. Everything that they said that they would do, they have done it. And we find that Joshua, as he calls for them and speaks to them, but he acknowledges all of these things. They had also agreed back in chapter 1 of our study in Joshua. We saw this early on in the study, but they had also agreed that they would not only do this. Joshua, when they come into the land, before they'd ever crossed over Jordan, the Lord had commissioned him as the leader, and he had sent the officers through the camp to announce, get your victuals ready, we're going to go over this Jordan. And then, just, it seems like for no reason, he addresses the tribes of Reuben and Gad and Manasseh. In chapter 1, verses 12 and following, and the Reubenites, and the Gadites, and the half-tribe of Manasseh spake Joshua, saying, remember the word which Moses, the servant of the Lord, commanded you, saying, the Lord your God hath given you rest, and hath given you this land. Your wives, your little ones, and your cattle shall remain in the land which Moses gave to you on the other side of Jordan, but you shall pass before your children, your brethren armed, all the mighty men of valor, and help them. He reminds them of this. And then they say the same thing to Joshua that they had said to Moses. They answered Joshua, saying, all that thou commandest us we will do. And whithersoever thou sendest us, we will go. We will do whatever you require us to do. Just as they hearkened to Moses, they would hearken to Joshua. And now Joshua makes mention of that in this as he commends them. You have obeyed my commands. You obeyed the commandments of Moses. You obeyed my commandments. You didn't ever leave your brethren. And you obeyed the commandments of the Lord. So at last, the men of the 2.5 tribes were dismissed to return to their possessions and to their families. Long-awaited reunion this was. But therefore now, he says, return you and get you to your tents. Long time. It had been 8 years. 8 years is a long time. And yet they had been faithful. 8 long years. Battling. Being away from their own tents. Away from their own families. Away from their own inheritance. 8 years. But now, at long last, the reunion. They're going to get to go home. Imagine the eagerness, of course, to see their families, but also their settlements. They just barely had time to see it, know that they loved it, and then they had to leave it. They saw their brethren settled, but they hadn't known any place to lay their head. They didn't have any place of their own. They're still living in encampments, while the others have their inheritance. Imagine, I said the eagerness, but imagine something else, the anxiety involved here. You remember what they did? They built sheepfolds, and they put their children into the cities so they'd have safety from the inhabitants of the land that were still remained alive. 8 years, they've been away from their families. A lot of things can happen in 8 years. invasions, loss of life, crop failures, loss of stock. What are they going to find when they get back? That has to be going through their mind. They have been faithful in all of this, everything that they had agreed to do, they've been faithful, and yet these things had to be weighing on them as they went. But being good soldiers, none of these things moved them. None of these concerns that would have kept us awake at night concerned them. Like Paul said, none of these things move me. They did not take their leave until the captain discharged them. Until Joshua said, "You can go home," they didn't go home. "Thou therefore endure hardness as a good soldier of Jesus Christ. For no man that warreth entangleth himself in the affairs of this life, that he may please him who's chosen him to be a soldier." They were under Joshua's command. It was their job to please Joshua, their commander. And therefore, they had to put these things out of their minds. They could not become entangled in concerns for what's going on back home. Well, that was a tough thing to do. That took a lot of grit. That took a lot of character to be able to do that. And they did it. You know, we will not take leave of this world to go home until our warfare is accomplished and our commander calls us home. These fighting men of Reuben and Gad and the half-tribe of Manasseh, they could say, "We've fought a good fight. We finished our course. We have kept our commitment faithfully." And now, says Joshua, "You can go home." They'd kept every commitment. They served well. You know, actually, only a Christian might have reason to desire an early departure from this life. And even we hang on to life, don't we? But we do know that the Apostle Paul was in such a place that he would say to depart and be with Christ is far better than this life of toil and suffering, and as Carl was pointing out this morning, a life of great hardship and beatings and all the things that he endured for the gospel, left for dead on more than one occasion. And I can see why that he would say to depart and be with Christ would be far better. And he did come to that place. He said in 2 Corinthians, "We that are in these tabernacles do groan. We groan not that we would be unclothed, but clothed upon with our house from heaven. We groan, knowing that to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord." But we realize that our purpose here must be fulfilled. And he realized that his purpose here must be fulfilled before he would consider going back home. He says that to remain is needful for you, to remain there in the harness, to remain in the fight, and not take an early leave to go to be with the Lord. It was better for them, the ones to whom he was ministering, the ones whose souls he was watching out for. In Philippians chapter 1 is where I was quoting, "I'm in a strait betwixt two, having a desire to depart and be with Christ, which is far better. Nevertheless, to abide in the flesh is more needful for you." Now these Reubenites and Gadites, the half-tribe of Manasseh, these soldiers, you know that, boy, to leave and go home, be with my family, that would be so much better. But nevertheless, to abide here is more needful for you. "And having this confidence, I know that I shall abide and continue with you for for your furtherance and joy of faith. So we realize that we have a purpose in this world, and we're not to leave this world until our work is done. It's kind of like, I believe it was Stonewall Jackson who told his wife when he was going to battle, "I can't die until my work here is done." He knew, he believed in a God who had control of these things, and he couldn't die before God was finished with him. And that was the confidence that he had. Well, we know that we're not going to leave this world until our work is done, when we finished our course, and hopefully we can testify as Paul did when that time comes, "I've finished my course, I've kept the faith." How patiently these good soldiers had waited. The chapter begins with the word "then." Then Joshua called them. Even though the fighting had been ended for some time now, the fighting had been over for a long time, and they still haven't been called before Joshua to receive theirs. They hadn't come forward. They hadn't, I think that I might have, knowing that it's done, knowing the fighting is over, and we've already received our inheritance, we already know where it is, I might want to go to Joshua and say, "Hey, we had an agreement, but we've kept it. Can we go now?" They didn't come. Joshua called for them. They didn't call for Joshua. Even though they had already been assigned their portion, but not only that, here in the book of Joshua, chapter 13, they were the very first to have their inheritance confirmed. Before all of them, before even Judah and Caleb. That was already settled. They didn't have to cast lots. They didn't have to go through any of that because it was already given to them. They knew where their inheritance was. And so yet they still remained without going back and going to Joshua and saying, "Can we go now?" Be patient, therefore, brethren, unto the coming of the Lord. Behold, the husbandman has long patience until he receives the early and the latter rain. Be ye also patient. Establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord draweth nigh. That is the instruction that we're given. Be patient. And did they ever show forth patience? Patience that are just, it's almost unbelievable. And they were discharged then from service, but they weren't just discharged, they were discharged with high commendations. I mean, they received some medals, if you will. They certainly, if they'd have given out such things in those days, they would have been in line to get a bunch of them. They were men of their word. Remember what they had promised. They had kept it all. They had kept everything that they had promised. And as we notice back in chapter 1, Joshua reminded them of that. He reminded them of the promise they had made. And then it's confirmed that everything that they had promised to Moses, they reiterated and promised the same to Joshua, and then they fulfilled everything that they had promised. They hadn't gone back on a single thing. These good men are commended for being faithful to their word, even though they had a have it now and pay for it later agreement. They didn't go back on that. They were good to their promise to Joshua, and this commendation is the equivalent of his saying, "Well done, thou good and faithful servant." That is what we want to hear our Savior say. "Well done, thou good and faithful servant. You've been faithful in all of these things that I've given you to do." And that is what Joshua tells to these. Now these were also commended for their unwavering affection for their brethren. You have not left your brethren these many days. Their loyalty to Joshua couldn't be separated from their love for their brethren. We see that in as you look at verses 2 and 3 together. The latter part of verse 2, he says, "And you have obeyed my voice in all that I commanded you. You have not left your brethren these days unto this day," these many days unto this day. "You were faithful to me, and you were faithful to the brethren." And their loyalty to Joshua couldn't be separated from their loyalty and their love for their brethren. And that is true with us as well. 1 John 4:7 says, "Beloved, let us love one another, for love is of God, and everyone that loveth is born of God. He who loveth God loveth his brothers also." The two go together. People that say they love the Lord, they love Christ, they love Jesus, but they do not love the brethren, that is not true. If you don't love the brethren, then you don't love the Lord either. How can you say, "I love God," but you hate your brother? How can that be, is the question that John asks. If you don't love your brother whom you've seen, how can you say, "I love God," whom you have not seen? So these two go together. And bearing one another's burdens is evidence of our love for Christ. Bear ye one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. They were bearing their brethren's burdens, helping them gain their inheritances, driving out the enemies and those that possessed those lands, driving them out, helping their brothers, bearing that burden for their brethren, demonstrating their love for the brethren, but also their love for the Lord and their love for Joshua. They were recognized for their obedience to God's law. You have kept the charge of the commandment of the Lord your God. Literally, you have kept the keeping. They had carefully and meticulously kept the Lord's commandments. You remember how God spoke to Joshua when he first commissioned him to be the leader, to take over after the death of Moses. "This book of the law shall not depart out of your mouth. You shall meditate therein day and night. You shall observe to do all that is written." All of these things, you're going to care for these things very diligently and meticulously and be very exact about it. And when we read this, you've kept the charge of the commandment of the Lord. You have kept the keeping. You have meticulously kept the Lord's commandments. And this pertained not only to their sworn obligations, but to their lives overall. This is what Joshua had observed in them, that they were godly. They were righteous men. As it should be, they were faithful to their word. They were faithful to Joshua. They were faithful to the people, and all of it was in obedience to God and His word. All of it was unto the Lord. And that's the only way to truly be obedient. Is whatever we do, do it unto Him. Now they are dismissed with a solemn charge and a benediction there in verses 5 and 6. This is the charge that a faithful leader would give. It almost sounds like he's their father. And I believe that being the very oldest of them all, and much older than any of the others, he saw himself as a father, not just their captain, not just their leader, but he was a father to them. And this admonition that he gives, this charge that he gives them, it sounds like it's coming from a godly and a faithful father. to his children. Take diligent heed to do the commandments and the law, which Moses, the servant of the Lord, charged you, to love the Lord your God, to walk in his ways, to keep his commandments, to cleave to him, and to serve him with all of your heart and with all your soul. It's almost like he said, I've seen you do this here. I've seen you do this in your service here to your brethren, to me. As you go back, continue to do that. Cleave to God. Keep his commandments. Lead your families in righteousness. Train your children in the things of the Lord. Be faithful to God. What a charge this is. Keeping this charge is key to their future happiness and their success. You've kept the keeping, he says, now keep the keeping. Continue to do that as you go home. Don't let these things slip. The blessing of the faithful minister or the faithful friend. This is not mere words, not mere formality. Our partings ought always to be occasions of prayer and benedictions. Sincerely prayer, praying for one another and blessing one another. But you see, they were sent away with blessings that were tangible blessings, not just words of praise and commendation. Those were valuable to them. To hear Joshua say these things, to commend them the way that he did, to acknowledge all of their faithfulness and how righteously they had lived their lives. They loved to hear Joshua say that. It meant a lot to them. But he had more blessings than just words for them. In verses 7 through 9, and now he sends them away, and he spake unto them, saying, Return with much riches unto your tents, and with much cattle, much livestock, silver and gold, and brass and iron, very much raiment. Divide the spoil of your enemies with your brethren. Load yourself down with all the spoil of war that we've taken from these Canaanites. Do you think there might have been any there that were objecting to this? If there was, we don't hear their voice. The land rightly belonged to the 9.5 tribes. The spoil, you might say, rightly belonged to them. Didn't they have spoil of their own, having taken the territories of these two kings? They had spoil of their own already. But yet, this territory that belongs to their 9.5 tribes, they are to share in this spoil. Why? Because they have helped to take it. And there's no indication that there was any objection from anyone here. They were given freely of the spoils so that they might share with those that stayed back, that stayed by the stuff. They left their wives, they left their children, and the men under the fighting age, they were left there, the young men. And they left them there. They were staying by the stuff, if you will. Now you go share with your brethren. You share the spoil with them. I'm reminded of 1 Samuel chapter 30. You remember when the Amalekites had invaded David's encampment at Ziklag, taken their wives and their children, burned their city. And David was distraught, as you might imagine. But he encouraged himself in the Lord his God, and he called for the ephod. And he inquired of the Lord, should I pursue them? Will I overtake them? God said, pursue them. You will overtake them, and you will take the spoil. And when they did, and the spoil was great, man, when they overtook the enemy and took everything they had, all the livestock, it was a huge amount of spoil. But before they left, David took 400 men with him in this battle. It would have been 600, but 200 of the men were weak and unable to go. They were sick or whatever. They couldn't go. So he said, you stay with the stuff. He took the 400, won the battle. And then afterward, when they were to divide up the spoil, the scripture says there were men of Belial that said those that stayed behind and didn't go fight, we're not sharing the spoil with them. And David came down on them. He came down on them hard. He said, this will never be. Those that stay by the stuff will divide the spoil the same as those that go to battle. And he made a statute that it should always be that way. Now here we see that before the days of David, we see that Joshua was of the same mind, and he says, you take of this spoil, even though it may technically only belong to the 9.5, you take it, you help to win it, you take it and you share it with those at home that stayed by the stuff. And so they did. They went away very full. They were loaded down with much riches to go back to their own possessions. The Lord has promised rewards to the faithful, even above our allotted inheritance. Ephesians 1:11 says, in whom we have obtained the inheritance. Literally, that word obtained is allotted. We've been allotted the inheritance with the Lord Jesus Christ. But you know that he promises rewards over and above that, in addition to all of those things. And these had left their homes, had left their families, and had gone to battle. In Mark chapter 10, it says that those that leave houses and lands and sacrifice these things to serve me, they will have restored to them 100-fold in this life, and in the life to come, eternal life. So we're given over and above even the inheritance. Now, certainly you can't make our inheritance in Christ more rich. But nevertheless, these are the things that the New Testament tells us. Now, I mentioned as I was reading, the half-tribe of Manasseh, it seems, received a special blessing from Joshua, and I really can't say dogmatically why that is. I do have a couple of suggestions. Was this because of their near kinship to Ephraim? Ephraim and Manasseh were brothers, and Joshua was an Ephraimite. Joshua's tribe, did that have anything to do with this? Or was it to help alleviate the pain of leaving their own kinfolks and going back home, leaving their kinfolk in Canaan to go back home? Maybe it was that. That seems more likely, because they're leaving half of their tribe in Canaan and they're going over on the east side, and they're going to be separated from their brethren. But whatever it is, Joshua gives them a special blessing. He blessed them. But having received the final blessing, these warriors left for the land of their possession in verse 9. And it's a little sad to read this. They returned and departed from their brethren. They were leaving their brethren behind. And it also gives us pause to read that they departed out of Shiloh, which is in the land of Canaan. Now, that is a seeming unnecessary notation, unless it's to call our attention to the spiritual loss as they were leaving to go back to their inheritance. Why would it say Shiloh, which is in Canaan? We know it's in Canaan. Well, I think it's to remind them you're leaving as you go back to your inheritance on the other side of the Jordan, on the east side. You're leaving Shiloh and the place of worship and the tabernacle and the sacrifices and the altar and all of these important things. You're leaving them here to go back over on the other side. These things are not there. They're here. Maybe it was to express the loss that they felt as they were leaving, which helps explain, if that's the case, what they did next. And we'll look at that next week, the Lord willing. What they did next is go build an altar on the other side, not in competition with Shiloh. That's what the people on the Canaan side thought when they saw what they were doing, but it wasn't at all. It was to show their oneness with them spiritually, and it was an altar that they built as a parallel with Shiloh, and showing that they were not separating themselves. The distance was not separating them spiritually from their brethren. And so they're to be commended on that. We want to look at that perhaps next week. But clearly the lessons for us here in this are many, many good lessons here for us. Faithfulness to our word, commitment to the cause of Christ, sacrifices that are made, and knowing that it's never in vain. The Lord recognizes, He acknowledges, He rewards, and the greatest reward that any of us could ever receive is to hear Him say, "Well done." And that's exactly what Joshua says to these. Well done. Everything you said, you've done it, and more. It wasn't that you did it in letter only. You did it to the letter. You kept it to the letter, but it wasn't letteristic, because it was willingly and wholeheartedly that they did this, not just keeping an obligation. And if that had been the case, they'd have been running up to Joshua and, "Let us get back home. It's time for us to go." No, they weren't. They were showing the utmost patience. Joshua calls them, commends them, rewards them, charges them, and then sends them home.